Redditors who work at remote places like forest officers, oil rig workers, etc. What insane things have you noticed while at work? I used to work at a Boy Scout summer camp. Every week I had to take a big group of campers to a secluded spot for their wilderness survival badge, where they had to build a shelter out of sticks, leaves, etc. and sleep in it overnight. The spot was only about 1/2 mile from the main camp, but we took them a circuitous route that made it seem really secluded. Anyways, on this one night, all the campers had made their shelters. We had cooked dinner, and we're all just sitting around the campfire. It was getting late, maybe 11 o'clock. So I sent all the campers to their shelters for the night and started cleaning up the fire. That's when we heard in the distance what sounded like church bells. They were pretty faint, but myself and my fellow staffers could definitely hear them. They went on for about 30 minutes, ringing every 30 seconds or so. We were all a little creeped out, as there were no churches or towns within 20 miles of us. After the bells stopped, though, the singing started. It was too faint to hear the words, but it sounded like church choir music. But a lot of people, and a lot more enthusiastic. Also, it was almost midnight at this point. The singing went on for well over an hour, sometimes quieting down until we almost couldn't hear it, sometimes getting so loud we thought it was getting closer. All of the campers were super creeped out, but I lied to them, telling them there was a church service going on in camp and that there was nothing to be scared of. Eventually, at almost 1 a.m., the singing stopped. I found out a few days later that there had been a large KKK rally only a few miles away that night, and that's what we had heard. Story 2. I used to work in the Gulf of Mexico on oil rigs for years, and it may not exactly be creepy, but I found it really unsettling. In deep, open water, the water itself is really clear, so everyone can plainly see all the tuna and barracudas hanging around the rig, waiting for the onboard cook to throw off whatever food waste he needs to. Every once in a while, a huge, great white shark would swim up from underneath and snatch a tuna, and it really took like less than a second. They're really scary. Commenter: I worked for a guy that spearfished underneath the rigs out in the Gulf. He said it was perfect since there were tons of fish underneath, and the sharks would never go between the legs. Just wait for a fish to leave. Plus, the view was amazing, looking down and seeing nothing but abyss. He loved it. I can only imagine how scared I would be. Story 3. I've worked in Canada's north for a few years now in oil and gas. It's pretty creepy when during night shift you realize a moose has just been standing at the tree line staring you down for an unknown length of time. Or finding bear tracks crossing the tracks you just made 5 minutes ago. Honestly, the silence of a snowy forest in the dead of night 100s of km away from anything is pretty spooky. When your only contact to the outside world is a radio channel nobody's listening to, you feel pretty alone. Story 4. I used to be a delivery driver, which doesn't sound very remote, because it isn't. However, I did have to deliver to some pretty remote places. One time I delivered to a trailer park just barely inside our designated delivery zone, and it was very dark and poorly lit. I leave my car running and keep the headlights and inside lights on to go deliver the pizza. Upon returning to my car, I sit down in the driver's seat and look up to see a creepy old man standing less than 3 feet from my side of the car. He was just staring. It was the equivalent of a jump scare. I just started driving forward, had to do a U-turn to get out of the park. When I turned around, the man was standing in the middle of the road, so I freaked out for a second before speeding around him only to watch him attempt to chase my car out of the trailer park. I put in my 2 weeks after that. Added, you reminded me of something creepy that happened to me. I also used to be a delivery driver, but for a supermarket in the UK. A lot of our customers were in the middle of nowhere, and my last delivery of the night was a new customer I'd never been to before. I was already running late from all my previous deliveries, and I was still trying to find this house at 10:30 p.m., even though my shift was supposed to finish at 10 p.m. I'm driving around the narrowest of country roads with nothing surrounding me but dark fields and hedgerows, looking for anything that might be a driveway. I hadn't seen another car or a person for miles. Then all of a sudden I hear a loud thud on the side of my van, like something was thrown at it. No trees or anything else around for something to fall from, and I remember it specifically hitting the side. I looked in my mirrors and out the window, but there was nothing around me. Then it happened again. Another thud on the side of my van. I drove back to the supermarket so fast and told my manager that I couldn't find the place. I had spent 30 minutes looking, to be fair. There was no house where the listed address, postcode, took me. Story 5. I was on a boat sitting on anchor in a secluded bay in the early hours in southeast Alaska a few years ago. I stepped outside for a smoke, and all of a sudden I heard the most horrific sounds of a wild animal being murdered by another wild animal. It went on for probably 10 minutes. I know it's just nature, but man, I can still hear that sound in my brain, and it haunts me. Story 6. I used to do agricultural work, alone in a field for 10 HRS a day kind of thing. The pure amount of times I heard the sound of running and snapped up to see literally nothing there was horrific. I was convinced it was surely animals between the trees for a while, but the weirdest moment was when I heard it loudly from a row of trees next to me and immediately ducked under to see the feet of whatever animal was running by, and there was absolutely nothing. I remember trying to stay calm and walking really fast to the toilet block and sitting in there for a good long while before I came back. I never thought I'd be so freaked out in the daytime, but there wasn't a soul nearby for quite a way, and it really amped up my imagination. Story 7. I was a field geologist in the outback about 12 hours north of Adelaide. One day I was driving the truck and saw what looked like a flagpole sticking up in the middle of nowhere. I wasn't anywhere near a farm or anywhere else that people would be, so I decided to drive over and check it out. It was a dead dog. Took some pictures and had my boss call the cops, but for the rest of the assignment, I was freaked out that some maniac was out there with me. Edit. I don't know if it was a domestic dog or a dingo or something. It was pretty well decayed when I found it. Story 8. I do a lot of work out in the woods. Creepiest thing was finding some headless doves. I also found sticks arranged in circles and paint on the trees in the same spot. Not sure if it was part of a ritual or not, but that's what I saw. Edit. Okay, lots of great points that it could have been just wildlife or cats catching the doves. That's totally possible. I've seen cats do that before, too. To add some more context, the type of doves found were not native to this area. It's possible they escaped or were released and had a run-in with a hungry house cat. And the painted circle of trees and sticks nearby was coincidence. Who knows? I certainly don't know what really happened, so it's all speculation. It's still the weirdest, creepiest thing I've ever found. Story 9. I was the creepy occurrence. I live on a ranch off of a quite dirt road. Our distant neighbors, nearest house is about 1 mile away as the crow flies, have had issues with people stealing things out of their outbuildings and storage sheds in the area. It was also late in the year, so it was starting to get dark around 6 p.m. So as a result, every time I would see headlights go down our road, I would watch to make sure they weren't stopping on the property. One evening, I see a vehicle going very slowly down the road and come to a stop at the end of our driveway, about 120 yards from our front porch. The vehicle is parked right in front of a 60s pickup I have parked, so I think Westcourtver it is might be looking to steal it or just looking over the property. Whatever the case, I decide to put on a black coat and grab my rifle to go investigate. It's dark out, so I stay out of the headlights of the vehicle so I can get close. I can tell it is a white van, but I don't see anything else distinguishing about the van. When I'm about 50 yards away, the van backs up and turns into our driveway. I freeze as the headlights wash across me standing in the middle of my driveway, and I see the reflective FedEx logos on the side of the van. Needless to say, the FedEx driver probably crapped his pants as he suddenly sees a dark figure standing in the middle of a field in the dark, holding a rifle. Surprisingly, after I try to give a friendly wave and smile, he continues up the driveway to the house, and I get to explain the situation and we both have a laugh. So that's how I got to be the creepy guy in some FedEx delivery driver's story. Story 10. I spent some time in the peat swamp forests of Borneo studying wild orangutan. We would go into the forest very early around 4 a.m. One morning, there was a clouded leopard on the trail we used to enter the forest. It was just crouched there watching us. We shouted, tried to act big. One of the indigenous people we worked with even took out his slingshot and shot rocks at it. He missed on purpose, just trying to scare it off. It stayed there for a good 5 minutes watching us before it slowly walked into the thick brush off the cleared trail. When we walked by, I shined my light to where it had walked to and could clearly see a pair of reflective eyes only 3 meters away crouched, watching us pass. Creepy, but also incredibly cool to see one in person for how critically endangered they are. Since I've got quite a few requests for pictures, I just posted a picture I took of a baby orangutan named Mercurer. Edit. These were wild orangutans. We tried our best to keep our distance and never tried to touch them. The goal was to observe them while trying not to affect their natural behavior. That being said, over my year there, I did get charged by one of the big dominant males in the area on 3 separate occasions, which is its own terrifying story to tell another time. He never did touch me, but sure scared the hell out of me and made me run. Story 11. I've been fishing out in the Gulf of Mexico, where they have some oil rigs. This rig wasn't being used, from what we knew, so we would get pretty close to it to fish for red snapper. While we were out there, we could have sworn we heard screams of a woman over and over. It was some crap, but the explanation was the wind making the noises as it blew through the rig. Well, that's what we were told, but it totally creeped us the duck out. Story 12. I'm not sure if this counts because it's a farm, but when you live on a farm, you work on a farm, so I guess I'll tell it. I grew up on a farm and in high school used to mess with my friends by hiding and making them find me. One night my friend was over and we were waiting on this other guy. We see him pull up, so we take off running to hide. It's funny because they have to wander around somewhere they're unfamiliar with, or go ask my parents and be told, too bad, you'll have to find her. It's like forced hide and seek. Anyway, this one night I saw my friend hide in one building while I ran for the trees. I was hiding under some bushes and heard breathing, like human breathing. There were no animals around. It creeped me out so bad I ran out of hiding to greet my friend. I felt so uncomfortable for the rest of the night. Sometime during the night, my dad heard something and went out to investigate. In the morning, he discovered that one of our cows was killed. Story 13. I spent several seasons working at a remote field camp in Antarctica, over 1,000 kilometers from the main station in McMurdo. Every once in a while, a skua bird or Antarctic tern would accidentally end up following one of the small planes, twin otter, out to our camp. Once there, though, they'd basically be stranded with no way to get back to the coast. I'd get out of my tent some mornings and see a lonely tern circling overhead, knowing it was a dead bird flying. It was quite creepy. Along these lines, when birds or seals do die down there, it's so cold and dry that their bodies don't decay either. They essentially mummify. Outside McMurdo at Scott's Discovery Hut, there is still a perfectly preserved seal carcass from 1912 sitting by the entrance of the hut. Story 14. In my brief stint as a rural health nurse, I was quite unnerved by how many of the families I worked with still practiced ritual sacrifice, even though on paper they identify as Catholic. There was in the Philippines, I got stationed in some very remote areas around Visayas. I mean, those who do it are hardly the majority, but they're definitely present. Story 15. I work as a polar bear guard, as in, I escort people across tundra and mountains and protect them from polar bears. I once saw a snowman totem with reindeer antlers coming out of his head. It was deformed, full of bullet holes, and rather creepy. There was one time when I was going to the gym at 6 in the morning, because, it's just to the gym I wasn't going to bring a gun. Then I got an alert on my phone saying a bear was in the area, so I decided to stay in bed and eat Maltesers. It later turned out that the bear was on my route to the gym at the exact time I would have been walking down without a gun, and it was dark and snowy, so I would definitely have been an entree for the bear. That was off duty, though. On duty, there's not really been any close calls, just the occasional, "Hey, look everyone, there's a bear way over there. Have a look through my binoculars." Also, just be a bit more alert. The rule is that if it is within 300 meters, I prepare to shoot it. If it is within 100 and coming towards me, that's when I really regrettably have to shoot it. I don't want to shoot a bear, and so far I haven't had to. I hope I never do. Story 16. Merchant seaman here. Nothing particularly creepy. Most of the time you're too focused on not hitting anything, getting position fixes, updating logbooks, etc., to really think about paranormal or spoopy crap. But the closest thing to creepy I've experienced recently has been a strange transmission over the radio. It started with a series of Morse code beeps followed by an accented female voice listing off random letters and numbers. Dunno what the duck that was about. Edit. I should clarify it was definitely number station-y, and obviously radio propagation is a thing, but this was off the Gulf of Mexico on a hot-ass day. Story 17. Working on ships. There was one night I was on a ship sailing through Alaskan waters, and it happened to be my first night ever seeing northern lights. I can't believe how awesome that was. It made the sky clear, made the night look like it was dusk. We were able to see clearly for miles. A few buddies and I hit the roof, or what we call Lido deck, at 1 a.m. just to gaze at it. An hour or so in, there was 6 of us on top, nearly the entire crew now. A big white spotlight shines at us. We were near land, but where the spotlight was above the water, and it wasn't low enough to be on a ship. This was very high up. It shined on us for about 15, 20 seconds. Once the light turned off, we looked to see what it was. Saw nothing. No trace of an aircraft or anything. Couple minutes go by, and the same light shined on us. This time it was on the other side of our vessel, above mountains. Still, unable to see what it was. We all saw it. We all have never seen any aircrafts hovering above these waters, especially at 2 a.m. We don't know what it was. We think it might have been some sort of silenced aircraft. The military was probably doing drills or something. But anyways, that was one of the weirder things to happen out on the ocean. Story 18. I worked in a store once in a really small town that was always absolutely dead. A customer every hour or so. Shifts all alone too, which I'm sure wasn't even legal. But hey. Anyway, it's a dark evening, and I'm sat on Reddit as usual when I hear the door open. I look up and see the back of a man as he begins walking down the first aisle towards the tin foods, and he appears to be talking to someone on the phone. I think nothing of it, and go back to Reddit. All of a sudden, I get this intense smell of soil and earth. I look up, and then the man's approaching the counter, and he's wearing some kind of overalls, and his face and long gray hair and body is just covered in dirt. That's when I notice he isn't on the phone at all and is just talking to himself in this absolutely bizarre tone. He sounded like a cartoon elf or something. He's just sort of murmuring and doing this really weird, hey sort of laugh. I'm just frozen solid as he stood at the counter in front of me thinking I'm about to be killed when a policeman storms through the door. He asks if I'm okay, to which I don't respond because I'm just in a complete state of what the duck is happening. Tells the man to come outside, to which he starts murmuring gibberish and saying the words legal over and over again. They come grab the man and put him in the back of the police car, and that's the last I ever heard of it. I have no idea who he was, what was going on, but I have never been so afraid of another person before. You know when you just sense a bad situation. So grateful the police showed up when they did. Story 19. Worked night shift at a prison for years. The one thing that really creeps you out is when a hit is put on someone in the middle of the night. Inmates' code says it is kept as quiet as possible. No one says a damn word. The only thing you'll hear are grunts and moans from the victims. Then it goes and stays silent. If you hear it happening, it's already too late to stop it. It'll be over before you pull your keys out. Occasionally, if someone needs medical attention, the first sign we got was an inmate approaching the bars saying they need to go to medical. The creepy ones are where no one shows up. All you get is grunts of pain, and that's it. Story 20. When I was 15 years old, I was doing my 4 a.m. newspaper delivery round on bicycle. I was driving into the garden of this one subscriber where I saw 2 guys with flashlights looking through the windows of the house. I was a bit in shock and just said, "Good morning, guys." They were just as much in shock, and an awkward silence followed. I tried to break the silence by asking if I could pass them to deliver the newspaper through the door. One of the guys said the person living in that house did something to his family, and they took it as an opportunity to get away in their car that was still running. When they were gone, I rang the doorbell at the house to tell them what happened, and they should keep an eye out. Story 21. I was serving as a fireman for my nation's compulsory national service. Once, we were called into the forest to retrieve a body deep along one of the running trails. He had apparently died and was found by a few morning joggers. What's creepy was, we found a straw doll at the foot of the tree. It was stabbed with a few red bobby pins in the head, facial area, and there was also an unknown talisman that was half burnt where the doll was sitting. When we took the body down, we had to carry him a few kilometers out of the forest, and halfway along the journey, a previously unnoticed wound on his face started bleeding. One of my mans sweared that it was from the same spot as where the bobby pin was stuck on the doll, but we could not confirm it as we left the doll where his body was found for the police, passed the body to the paramedics, and booked our way out of the area. Story 22. We have a PTO pump spot that comes out of a canal for our rice fields. When I was like 17 years old, my uncle found 2 bodies dumped in the little sump area where our pump sat. Both of them that were dumped there had the same tattoos, so they think it was gang-related, but it was 45 minutes away from where that gang operated. I still look in the hole every time I go by there, and that was 20 years ago. Story 23. Spent a summer in Wyoming going to BLM land and other remote locations collecting data on bats and herpetofauna. Heard a lot of weird noises like mountain lions screaming, deer snorting, what sounded like owls fighting. Woke up one morning to find 2 bull moose sleeping 20 yards behind my tent. All of this was part of the job, until one night a truck was driving towards us when we were on a BLM square in the southwestern part of the state. The truck was going overland, no road, and was slowly driving at us. It stopped about 100 yards away, turned off the lights, and we could see a person get out. They walked a full circle around us at Tilda 100 yards away, got back in the truck, and turned around. This was after dark, and this shadowy figure did a complete circle around us. You could hear them walking through the sagebrush, and I'm sure they could hear us talking. We packed up after that and drove to a hotel an hour away. I called the office and told them I was taking a gun when we went back out. Didn't like having the bear mace as our only defense. Story 24. Some friends and I were fishing a small pond just after dark for catfish. We started to hear sounds coming off the water like someone throwing softball-sized rocks, but they were coming from all over the pond. We thought someone was messing with us, and we called out a few times for them to stop, but we eventually got freaked out and left. Cut to a few years later, I'm fishing a different pond and hear the same sound. Turns out it was a beaver slapping its tail in the water to drive me from its territory. When beavers become problems in rivers, they relocate them to ponds in town. Story 25. Spent a summer doing conservation work out in the absolute middle of nowhere in Wyoming. Was part of a crew that would spend 2 weeks camping in remote places to do manual labor in places machines couldn't get to. For this story, we were building new hiking-biking trails in the back portion of a designated wilderness area in a high-altitude desert. This means that the nearest civilization was a 2-hour car ride to a town of 41 people in a sandy soil area where tracks last forever. It was the middle of our stint during the early part of the night where everyone else had gone to bed, but I stayed up to read, so maybe 11:30 or so. Still pitch black outside, clouds had covered stars, so my headlamp was probably the only light on in a 40-mile radius. Suddenly I hear footsteps walking around our camp and head towards the tents from where I was in the community tent. That sound immediately put me on edge as I felt the hair on my arms raise and my adrenaline spike. I recall thinking to myself that 2 things are very wrong since the person was not using a light to see and the footsteps were not coming towards me from the tents. Rather, it was the opposite. Within the 4 seconds it took me to drop my book, get up, and turn the corner of the tent to cast my light on the sleeping tents. The sound had stopped, but I saw tracks in dirt before me. Looked like they came from one end of camp, looked into my tent, walked through the sleeping tents, and kept going out of camp again. I don't know if I was making too much noise or not by walking around, but the rest of my crew ended up waking up and asking me what was going on from inside their tents. After explaining what I found, they all got up to look at the boot prints in the dirt. They were damn near perfect copies of my own boots, except for one small thing. I had a rock stuck in my treads that messed up the symmetry. I was wearing fairly common work boots, except I also happened to wear US size 15 double-wide boots, so there was no way in hell this was one of the other crew members. I don't think any of us slept much that night. Never saw or heard anything more after that night. A light rain removed the tracks a couple days later, but I do remember none of us were willing to step on the prints themselves and choose to step over them like cracks in the sidewalk. Story 26. I work on North Sea oil rigs on an ad hoc basis, off the coast of Scotland. Wouldn't say anything was particularly paranormal creepy, but it can be very unsettling, weird place. Fog can come rolling in out of nowhere, and other rigs you can see off the sides can disappear in front of your eyes. Sometimes you can't see the walkways 6 feet in front of you, or if you're walking over grading, you can't see the sea below your feet, about 60 m down from Feck to sea, but you can hear it, albeit muffled. The fog can roll in over the course of a few minutes too, so a perfectly clear day becomes pea soup. You can also feel the rig moving, swaying on high winds/rough seas. Even though it's a fixed leg platform, very unnerving to feel your office swaying when it shouldn't be. My last trip was my first ever night shift, and I found it particularly unsettling, as you've got the background noise of the plant. But I walked around the whole rig without seeing another living soul for the whole shift. Usually, there are about 130 people on board, although smaller rigs have smaller headcounts. Usually once a trip I'm hit by this awareness that you are just very isolated and in the middle of nowhere. Most rigs I've worked on are an hour's chopper ride from land. So if things go wrong, it can escalate very quickly. Story 27. Lived up north for a while on a 3-year job. A local took me way out into the woods one night because he swore that at midnight at this one spot you could see the ghostly carriage where some people froze to death. Obviously expected to see nothing. So we're sitting there in absolute pitch black darkness. You can't see your hand in front of your face or anything around you. The sky is slightly gray from the thin cloud cover reflecting distant lights, but that's it. You can't even really make out the tree line. We never do see a carriage or anything. At about 12:20 or so, we're just smoking and chatting, thinking about leaving, when we hear the unmistakable sounds of someone walking through the underbrush. Loud crackling of breaking sticks and branches. But still, everything is black. It gets closer and louder, but we don't see anyone coming. There's nothing. And all we can think is how it's basically died to trudge through these woods at night. Good way to get a stick in the eye at the very least. And eventually you will twist an ankle or break something when you step off a ledge. The ground around here is very uneven, but it's definitely someone coming. Crack, snap, snap. In the pitch black? Nope, we drive the hell out if there. We weren't afraid it was a ghost. We were afraid it was a person insane enough to be marching through the woods without a light. Do not want to meet that guy. Story 28. My parents live pretty far back in the country and have one neighboring house. The neighbors would let their basset hound outside for about 10 minutes to use the bathroom every morning. One morning, they let him out and he didn't come back inside. After a couple minutes, they walked out to his favorite bathroom spot and found him dead. Judging from the tracks, a mountain lion had ambushed him and carrying the body away. What I thought was the creepiest part was that the family hadn't heard a sound. Story 29. Used to teach outdoor education, which was essentially just summer camp during the school year, and school groups would come up and spend a few days at the camp. On their last night, we would always tell them a scary story around the campfire. It was the same scary story every time. We worked in partners, so there were always 2 staff members for every school group. One staff member would tell the story and the other staff member would go hide in the forest and make scary noises. So I'm telling the story and every few minutes there's like a snap of a twig or rustling in the bushes. And of course, as always, the kids all get freaked out and they start getting scared. It's very fun. Well, as I'm telling a story, I'm walking around the campfire looking at all the kids' faces, and I noticed a familiar one, my partner Eric, sitting there smiling at me, wondering why I'm staring at him. My heart has never started beating so fast in my life. Eventually, I sped through the story and all the kids left, and I explained to Eric that I thought it was him in the woods, and his eyes got very wide, and he said, "Are you telling me that that wasn't one of the staff members?" So we both ran back to the main road. Story 30. My mom used to live in a small town in the Cascade Mountains and worked as a forest ranger. The creepiest thing that happened was when the oldest male ranger kept hitting on her and trying to get her to come home with him. Not very out of the ordinary. But many years later, after she'd left the town, she found out he had been convicted of manslaughter and had killed a young female ranger right before she got hired. She would have probably been his next target. Story 31. Used to be a supervisor for a janitorial company, and a couple times a week, I had to go to a middle school and clean their hallway floors and gymnasium with a Zamboni-type vehicle that mopped and scrubbed the floor. When I was there, I had the whole school to myself. Used to get finished quickly and go to the library and read while eating my dinner. Well, one morning after being there, I get a call from school security and they want me to come in. When I get there, I see a police car too. I think. They ask me a few questions like, "Did you notice anything out of the ordinary or strange while you were here last night?" No, I hadn't. usually have headphones in. Security then shows me camera footage of someone breaking into one of the classrooms while I was riding the Zamboni not far away. I was there for another 2 hours. Nothing was stolen. But the worst part was they didn't have footage of the person leaving. They didn't go out the way they came in, and police had to sweep the entire school. Never did find out what happened with that one. Story 32. I work for a medical examiner and used to be on the graveyard shift alone. The first night I was on at midnight on the dot, our air system shut off, which caused the vents to warp. That crap sounded like somebody running through the vents in the ceiling on all fours. Thankfully, I got used to it, but deaf creepy at first. Another night, we lost power, and stupid me watching a horror movie, working so hard, almost crap my pants when everything went dark, and knowing that a room with around 30 dead bodies in it was walking distance away. That one I stayed in my car for, not to mention the constant long, dark, red-lit hallways. Glad I'm not on overnight now. Story 33. We were wrapping up for the day in northern Canada. I am fueling up the side boom. I'm all by myself at this point because I was tired of listening to the laborers whine of the cold, so I told him I would take care of the rest. Think bulldozer with no blade but a giant metal boom on the side that we use to razor and lower pipe. It's February, so pitch black. I keep hearing some weird sound. I can't quite hear it because the pump is too loud. I search around a couple times and see nothing. I get in the truck and take off drive past the front of the side boom to see a cougar sitting on top of a dirt pile 15 feet away. The damn thing was just watching me there, and probably could have ended me without me even realizing it. I've never seen a cougar in the wild before, and it's hard to understand just how big they are and how powerful until you see one up close. That thing leaped off the 6-foot pile and probably didn't touch ground for 15 to 20 feet. It's terrifying to think something so big and powerful could just be sitting there deciding if they want to make you dinner. Story 34. I used to work as an alligator hunting guide for trophy hunters during my summers, south of New Orleans. Spending sunup to sundown deep in the heart of Cajun swamp territory definitely left me seeing some weird and creepy things. The first one that comes to mind is when I saw what my hunting partner at the time called the loup-garou. I personally would have called it a chupacabra, but that's because I'm a native of the Southwest, not the South. We were riding through an area deep in the swamp looking for signs of a big gator. The banks were close on both sides of the boat. There was barely enough water for us to push ahead, but those mud boats are impressive and can practically run on dry land, so onwards we pressed. Suddenly I saw a gray flash in the trees out of the corner of my eye. It made me nervous. Swamp deer are small and shy. There's not many mammals that want to hang out in thick undergrowth and knee-deep mud and hidden gators. I tapped my partner's shoulder to catch his attention over the sound of the motor and pointed in the direction I saw the flash. He cut the motor and asked if it was a gator slide. I shook my head and said I had no idea what it was, but I saw something. As we were looking around us, the creature I saw stepped out from the trees. It was big on all fours with mottled gray skin. Its movements were janky, giddy. It had a canine-like face and it locked eyes with me and I felt sick to my stomach. My partner immediately struck the motor back up and we reversed out of there as quickly as we could. My rational brain said, poor creature with mange, either a massive coyote or maybe a wild dog. But my primal monkey brain was screeching, monster, run or die. It was definitely a freaky experience, even knowing what it probably was. Story 35. During college that was located away from major cities, the woods were all around us. That being said, there was a highly rated trail, the Loyal Sock Trail, which was about an hour drive from the university. I invited a friend to come with me as he had never been on an extended backpacking trip, a 50-plus mile trail that we intended to backpack over the 4-day weekend. I am an Eagle Scout who has spent countless hours in the woods and went on backpacking trips consistently throughout my college experience. As many have said before me, you get used to the minor spooky things happening, coyote howls, raccoons in the middle of the night, even the occasional unknown noise. The scariest thing to find in the woods, however, are people. We were about 20 miles into the trail, and being Pennsylvania, where the underbrush and trees line the trails pretty densely, I always walk about 100 meters off of the trail to reduce the chances of me disturbing people disturbing me, especially in the early morning when I choose to sleep in. Following that same strategy, my friend and I go out of our way to be in this amazing spot a good ways off of the trail, where it would even be difficult to see our flashlights from the trail. This spot was on a peninsula where a creek met a river, meaning there was only one way into our camp and only one way out. We start a fire, cook our food and drink some, but not enough to get either of us drunk. We put the fire out about midnight and head into our individual tents. All is quiet. It is the fall semester, so leaves are on the ground, the moon is brightly shining through the bare trees, and the air is cool. The only noise is the occasional time when I would hear my friend turn over in his sleep. Then I hear the voices. The voices sounded very close for being on the trail 100+ meters away. I check my watch. 3 a.m. Who hikes at 3 a.m.? We are 20 miles in. I slowly get out of my sleeping bag, slowly unzip my tent, only to see my friend peeking out of his tent in the exact same fashion. He quickly moves his finger over his mouth in an exaggerated hush signal, then used the same hand to frantically motion towards the way of the trail. Then we see them. 4 adults, 3 men and 1 woman walking directly towards our camp. No lights illuminating their path. They are walking silently at this point. Only one of them has a backpack. An impossibility for the long hike. They were 1/3 of the way through. Being a long trip, you bring wood-cutting supplies to chop branches into smaller branches to burn. For me, this was a survival knife. Grabbing the knife, believing it is my only way of defending myself. I am more disheveled than I ever have been, especially knowing that a knife is barely defense at all. These people walk into our site, sit down by our extinguished fire pit, and just sit there for what felt like an eternity. My friend speaks up and asks what they are doing in our campsite. Without answering the question, they ask if we have any food. Having packed as lightly as possible for the long trip, we had only a few extra Mountain House MRE-style meals. I grab one out of my bag and toss it to one of the men. In rapid succession, I ask why they aren't using a light, if they need help finding the trail, and why they are hiking so late. They respond with the following. 1. We don't use lights. 2. We know where the trail is. 3. It is better to hike late at night. Unnerved at this point, my friend asks them to leave. They respond by asking if we want to light the fire and hang out for a bit. No, we do not. They grab their bag, get up, and leave without speaking another word. We watch them leave and take shifts, making sure that they didn't come back. Needless to say, we both got very little sleep that night. When the sun rose the next morning, we finally got real sleep. By the afternoon, when we woke up, it all felt like a weird dream of sorts. The only evidence was a fuzzy cap that they must have dropped that I have to this day. I have never had something as weird, spooky as that happen in the woods, and hope to never have it happen again. In the 8 years since that trip, I haven't been back to the Loyal Sock Trail. Story 36. I'm not sure this counts, but I'm a teacher at an urban public school and was at work late grading and getting ready for the next day. Time had kind of flown by, and before I knew it, it was 7 p.m. I start packing up to leave in a building that is, in theory, locked and empty besides me, when our Alice alarm goes off, indicating an armed intruder in the building. I am 1, alone 2, young 3. Freaked AF because I'm absolutely not ready to fight a gunman over my lesson plans. I book it out of the school and dive into my car, hearing the alarm blaring the entire time. I peel out the parking lot and can see in my rear view the alarm lights still flashing and debate never going back. Cause duck that lil mau. Turns out they were doing routine maintenance and didn't send out an email to the teachers. Story 37. Biologist lots of time in remote areas. 1. Met labs, often tucked away in absentee landowner property, usually some POS RV. 2. Met houses, homes that were clearly abandoned, 40 years ago but clearly occupied within the last 5, if not currently. I got curious a few times and poked around inside, but didn't push too much because they would have heard me in the brush long before I got inside the house. I'd see substances stuff, 18-plus movie, junk food, mattresses droog in on the floor. Think of the row houses in Amsterdam in The Wire. 3. 2 of my colleagues have found dead bodies. They were all illegal immigrants crossing north into the U.S. Most accidents, 1 was a gunshot. I've been in areas with unsolved murders. I just tread lightly with the locals. Think of the Ozark TV show. 4. More sad than creepy but abandoned graveyards. Dozens of them. Locals try to keep up, but there is a natural progression of decline and neglect until they're outright forgotten. 5. I got shot at once. 6. I stumbled into a herd of feral hogs at night in really tall cattails. That was more frightening than the snakes, alligators, etc. I couldn't see them, but they were freaking out that I was there. 7. I've seen a few shrines of pagans or whatever, but they're pretty harmless and don't leave any permanent damage to anything. No harm, no foul. 8. A guy in the front yard of his trailer house, deep in the woods in a swamp, crap in a 5-gallon bucket. Very awkward eye contact. Honestly, not much out there is creepy without a human element thrown in. Story 38. When I was in the Navy, I saw a UFO. A lot of people will tell me no, it was just some weird lights. But nothing created on the planet Earth moves the way this did. It was just getting dark outside, underway at about 10 kts in the Mediterranean, dead flat seas. I'm sitting watch up on the Brightbridge console when I notice a single point of light in the air. To me, it's what looks like a helicopter hovering above one of 2 merchant vessels in sight. I check the AIs and get the names of the 2 vessels and relay that information over to our TIC IDs. It's not incredibly uncommon for a merchant vessel to have a helicopter on board, but there is absolutely no signal coming from the bearings I was giving, and no record of either ship having a helicopter. At this point, I started to get more concerned and curious. The point of light is still hovering above one of the ships. I head out to the port bridge wing and get on the big eyes, high-power mounted binoculars, to see if I can get a better look at the aircraft. It appears to be at least 11 nanometers away, and even with the magnification, all I can see is a single point of light. At this point, the OOD is interested as well and joins me on the bridge wing. and we watched this point of light zip 15 nanometers in a matter of 3 seconds and stop directly over the other merchant vessel. There was no wind-up acceleration. It just went from hover to full speed to full stop instantly. The officer standing with me was completely speechless and in awe at what just happened, and called for a higher power air radar search on that vector. Still nothing at all. The point of light hovers above the ship for a minute or so, then at about half the speed from before flies to a point between the two vessels over the open ocean. It makes 4 dips down to the water, and then back up to about 10,000 feet. Then it started to make an infinity loop pattern in the sky. It was dropping from around 10,000 to 2,000 feet and back up at an incredibly rapid pace. No human-made aircraft is capable of this amount of precision, acceleration, and deceleration, or speed. Before the two of us could even react, the craft blasted across the sky at a slightly upward angle, completely silently, leaving no trail or trace at thousands of miles an hour before disappearing into the open sky. The officer of the deck standing next to me had his mouth wide open, eyes practically bugging out of his head behind the binoculars. He looked at me and said, "Red Clam, what in the duck did we just see?" To which I replied confidently, "We just saw a UFO, sir. We reported it to CIC as a glare on the windscreen of the bridge. That we messed up, haha. But we know what we saw with our bare eyes." The two vessels involved got underway a few minutes after our report, each heading back towards the coast at 15 knots, along the exact same track. I lost track of the vessels when I got off watch 4 hours later, but I've always been curious about them and where they ended up. Till Doctor, the officer of the deck, and I saw a UFO while on watch in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. Story 39. I worked at a public forest. One day we had someone report a dead animal on the side of one of our trails. A few of us from the front desk hiked out to see what it was. It looked like a giant piece of liver, maybe. Just a pile of smooth, red meat. And it was wrapped up in a t-shirt with some coins scattered around it. We called our rangers to go check it out, and one of them was pretty sure it was a placenta. The weird part is you have to check in through a front desk. So someone either snuck a liver. We never got an answer on what the pile of meat was, how it got there, or why. Story 40. Actually, I don't work in remote places, but when my father was sent to Alwar, Rajasthan, for archaeological study, I encountered a very strange thing. Our house was near a small forest. One morning, I saw a group of blue bulls, a kind of Asian antelope. They were 5 in number, and they were running in circles around a skull for like 30 minutes, and then one of them took it into the forest, and they all followed him silently. It was such a weirdo sight, it still gives me creeps. Story 41. I work on large ships. If you get a clear view of a hall or passage that runs the whole length, you can actually see the whole ship warp and twist with the sea. If the passage isn't very well lit, it can look like a scene from a horror movie. Story 42. I'm a machinist, and I was working by myself in this old warehouse at night. I would see stuff moving around, and I would get creeper out. This is when ghost hunters became popular. So I started to ask questions. What's your name? Can you show me that I'm not alone? Seconds later, a 3/8 Allen wrench came bouncing across the shop and landed at my feet. It didn't fall of the machine. It slid. I was cutting micarta, which is like wood, and you could see the slid marks in the chips. I said thank you to the ghost, shut down and left. I never went back. Story 43. I don't work out in the woods or anything, but me and my dad were hunting in the Pacinos. So me and my dad were sitting in a hunting tower. It was cold as balls out, and we start hearing what sounded like one of those old religious chants where they sing all together in Latin while walking in a straight line. It kept getting closer till we saw movement a BT 20 meters ahead, and then we saw a group of ABT 10 to 30 people wearing all white holding candles, and then 5 more people with rifles and shotguns standing in the front, the back, and on the sides. We let them pass, and they were staring at us as they walked by. It was scary as all hell. At 10 mins after they walked by, we went over to where they were standing, and it was snowy out there, and there were 0 footsteps in the snow. Until this day, we still don't know what the hell we saw that day. Story 44. I'm in the Navy and work on aircraft carriers. A girl sadly dead in one of the spaces right near where me and my shop slept. One person swore he saw her sitting in the chair as he was getting undressed one day and ran screaming out of the berthing. I waited about a week to go into the space where she hung herself. And when I did, I heard the loudest screeching noise I had ever heard in my life. I quickly turned around and got the duck out of there. The system connected to where she slept didn't work at all for the next 2 weeks or so, too. The systems break a lot, so it was pretty coincidental that it happened just as she did this. Story 45. Mostly just a lot of tweaker bullcrap, but there was a time when I was hiking in a wilderness area and saw a bunch of trash bags hidden under some trees about a quarter-mile off trail. About 10 miles from the nearest road. Noped out of there pretty quick. My biggest fear at work is finding a body in the woods. Story 46. I once delivered some soda to a grocery store in the middle of nowhere around 2010, like an hour from any freeway, and the manager had at least 50 pictures of Burt Reynolds pinned up in her office. Does that count? Story 47. I worked in a salt mine under Lake Erie a couple years ago, and generally speaking, when things are brought down, they're never brought back up. It takes a lot of time to disassemble everything up top, secure and cover the parts, and put it back together down below, and vice versa. So there's tons of old trucks, tractors, and countless other things lined up in the far side of the mine. Anyway, in the 80s, U of Michigan and Cal Irvine were studying proton decay and trying to capture measurements when it actually happened. Conducting this experiment topside is problematic because of cosmic rays and other forms of interference, so the mine was chosen as 2,000 feet of Earth absorbs pretty much everything. So they dug out a pool, about 80 by 70, filled it with 264,000 gallons of purified water, and put fancy cameras and other equipment along the side. They had a whole shop, lab, and dive center down there. I don't think they ever captured a proton decaying, and eventually the grant money ran out after a few years. So the mine threw up some caution tape on the main steel door leading to the study, and that was that. Fast forward 20 years, and I'm working there as an electrician, and I get a job to fix some big conveyor motor drive. So I set off and try to cannibalize some parts off old equipment. I remember one of the old-timers telling me there's a bunch of abandoned equipment in an area by the Kepi lift, the main elevator. I get over there and find a big steel door falling if its hinges with some very old caution tape laying on the ground. The whole study had to be accessed through this one door, which was dug into the wall, so after a while, the earth slowly crushes, bends, and pushes the ground up. After several tries, I yank the door open and step inside only to crap myself and fall back when I see a full scuba outfit, wetsuit, mask, belt, gloves, hanging 3 feet inside. So I collect myself, find that I didn't actually crap myself, how I'll never know, and go inside, past the goddamn scuba dude. Everything inside was left exactly how it was left 20 years ago. Coffee cups left out, day planners, job schedules, along with tons of scuba gear, oxygen fill tanks, and computers. I make it about 10-ish feet to the edge of the pool, and it's hard to see if the water's still in it because there's no wind to move it. But eventually, I see it's still there. 60-plus feet of pure water in an absolutely dark pool. The sight of a huge black pool in a huge black hole in the ground, lit only by the small amount of light my cap lamp put out, and the absolute silence of being underground made me really uncomfortable, so I left in a hurry. Story 48. Not work-related, but while I was living in rural Australia, I went to a swimming hole with some friends. You have to walk down a rainforest trail from the road for about 20 miles to get to the swimming hole. There were no other cars parked near the trail when we got there, and we didn't see anyone else the entire time we were swimming. Anyway, we were there in the late afternoon and the sun was starting to go down, so we make our way back to where we parked our car. It gets dark by the time we make it to the road, and we have our phones out as flashlights. Parked right next to our car is an old camper van. Lights are off and the side door is wide open with no one inside. There's no one around we can see, so we're kind of spooked and quickly get in our car and start driving. We get down the road a little bit and see headlights behind us. The road ends near the swimming hole, so it must be the camper van following us. Thankfully, the lights turned down a side road before we got to the highway, and we didn't see them again. Still wanted to check the car boot when we got home. Story 49. My oldest brother used to work the overnight sprinklers on a golf course. He took me out one time just for fun, and as we were driving uphill on a fairway, a figure of a lady appeared in the headlights at the top of the hill. My brother steered a little to the left of her and kept driving right on by. I stared right into her eyes as we drove by, and she stared back. Her eyes glowed like a cat in the night. As soon as we were out of voice range, I asked my brother, "What the hell was that?" He calmly responded, "Yeah, she lives on the golf course and likes to terrorize the workers from time to time. I usually see her out here once a week." All right, cool. Story 50. I do a lot of stream work, so I spend time out in pretty rural areas, walking streams and rivers. Once my coworker and I were working in a more urban environment and came across what we initially thought was a body, which of course triggered, "Oh crap," from us, but it ended up being a firefighter's dummy that had fallen down a hill. We felt pretty dumb. Other notable things include a small grave in the middle of nowhere for someone's dog, pretty sad, and a stuffed rabbit with shotgun shells placed where its eyes should be, a mannequin very purposely placed in a chair in the middle of the woods, and lots of little random altars. I also did work in Myrtle Beach, what a hellhole, and accidentally walked into an inhabited homeless camp. I was peering into a stormwater grate when I looked up and saw a homeless person standing in his shelter staring at us and saying nothing. I felt like I was trespassing, so we quietly left. Story 51. I was in Southeast Alaska for around 15 days a few summers ago. We had just finished up dinner and washed out our pots and pans and gone to our respective tents in the trees along the shore we had stopped at for the night. The spot we had chosen to camp wasn't ideal. The tide was set to come in pretty far that night, and it would only leave us with a few feet before the water would be lapping at our tent flaps. But we also didn't care that much as it had been raining and incredibly windy that day, so kayaking was hardly any fun at all, and we needed to stop. About 45 minutes after we had said goodnight to one another, I heard some splashing in the tidal zone, probably 20 feet from my tent. I didn't think much of it because a few times before, when in Alaska, we had stopped at beaches where the tide had risen to within a few feet of our tents. Anyway, I try to ignore it, although in my mind I'm freaking the duck out. Our camp spot was less than ideal if you wanted to escape in the middle of the night. We were at the base of a relatively steep hill that was covered in alders and slick with rain. To the left, probably 70 feet from where we camped, there was a rocky outcrop that went out into the water and was about 20 feet tall and steep enough that you couldn't climb it. If, for example, a grizzly bear, and there were a lot out that time of the summer, we had seen 4 or 5 that day alone, patrolling the beaches, wanted to see what was going on down the beach and walked towards us from the right, it would basically seal off our movement. Sort of like putting the cork back in the wine bottle, not many places to go. Anyway, after 15 minutes of hearing splashing, I start to try to rationalize it enough to go to sleep. But that's when I start hearing something other than splashing. This incredibly high-pitched gargling sound breaks through the night's relative quiet. It sounded as though 2 cats had gotten into a fight, but every time they let out a scream, the other cat would push the one cat's head underwater. This went on for a good 20 minutes. After it died down, I hear, "That's weird, huh?" from the other tent, obviously trying to downplay the incident. I, being scared as duck, just reply, "Yep, going to sleep." Another 15 minutes pass without much sound, but then the same gargling breaks through the night, this time much, much closer. The noises are deeper this time, more guttural. It sounds like an old man fighting with a cat, and each time either of them shriek, they are forced underwater. The splashing intensifies, and it sounds like it's right outside my tent. I think that the fear of whatever was going on eventually just zapped me of all energy, because eventually I fell asleep. I just remember that I didn't move a muscle, and I didn't move for so long that all of my muscles ached after a while, and I could feel my heart beat in my throat all night long. Anyway, we woke up, had breakfast, broke down the tents, and got back on the road. Didn't hear it ever again. A few weeks later, I did some Googling, and I'm pretty sure that it was just some sea otters fighting each other in the intertidal zone. But it was scary as duck. I'll link the YouTube audio of the noises if I can find it. Story 52. Not me, but a coworker used to work at a piggery. She said she would always see someone in the corner of her eyes. Boards would be written up like someone was checking on her sows for her. Things cleaned up, like someone was helping her. Apparently, she thought she was going mad and described seeing a dude around, and the others said, "Oh yeah, we think he died a while back at home." All the staff had seen him, but just sort of ignored it. Story 53. I'm a little late to this thread, but I hope this doesn't get buried because this story still haunts me. I worked as the county historic preservationist in southern Appalachia, working on the buildings and properties the county owned. One of the benefits included with my job was living on site at one of the historic properties. The historic house was an imposing brick mansion built in the 1810s, and I lived in a small caretaker's house about 20 feet away. This was in the backwoods. So to deter trespassing and vandalism, the county had built an 8-foot-tall fence around the entire 5-acre parcel and put barbed wire on top of the fence. I mention this all just to show it was basically impossible for anyone, or anything, to jump or climb over the fencing and onto the property. One night, after working late at another property, I pulled up to my entrance gate, let myself in, locked it behind me, and then drove the 100 yards down the gravel road to my house. There were no lights on the property, so I could only see by my headlights. As I turned my car around the corner of one of the outbuildings and parked it, my lights shone on a thing that I still have a hard time describing effectively. It was the size of a deer, but with long, spindly legs and long, shaggy hair, almost like a taller maned wolf, if you've ever seen pictures of one of those. That alone shook me, as there was no way something of that size should have been able to get through or over my fencing. What follows is absolutely true. I got out of my car to get a better look at what the hell the thing was, and as I opened the door and got out, the thing took off running away. Not on 4 legs, but on 2. I literally watched this thing raise its back up, stand at full height on its back legs, and sprint away. I absolutely freaked out at that point, grabbed my mag light and my shotgun from inside and tried to find the thing again. There was no trace, no tracks or anything. I have no idea how it got in or out of my property. I didn't sleep at all that night, just sat on my couch with my shotgun watching my front door, hoping that whatever I saw didn't come back and burst in. I cannot explain what the hell I saw that night, but it still raises the hair on my neck every time I think about it. Story 54. So in college, I'd wait for my roommate to get off of work at the new parking garage my campus built. He was a security guard on the night shift. Nothing too crazy most of the time, but one day he finished his shift, and I told him I'd meet him outside. He leaves the garage and says, "I don't think you're going to believe me when I tell you this, but I have to tell someone while it's fresh in my mind." The next part is how I remember him telling me while we sat in the car. I was in the office chatting it up with the custodian when he pointed to the security camera screen and told me there's a guy in the stairwell. We both looked at the camera closely, and sure enough, there's a guy just standing on a landing in the stairwell in an old-timey suit, bowler hat and everything. The security guard told me he'd start cleaning at the bottom of the stairs, and if he saw the gentleman, he'd tell him to leave. I told him I'd come up the landing and do the same. I didn't see him on my way to the landing, so I made my way to the stairs while calling out that the garage was closed for the night in case he was hiding. While walking through the stairwell, I startled the custodian because he was expecting to see Mr. Suit as well, but no one left the stairwell at the bottom. I told him I had to check out the rest of the grounds and that maybe he slipped out another way, even though there was really no way either of us could have missed him. I'm approaching the ramp of the next to last landing of the top of the garage, and I see an older woman in an old-timey dress and umbrella. She's going up the ramp in the distance. I yell, "She shouldn't be up here," and swiftly pick up the pace before I lose sight of her going to the top level. As soon as I arrived to the ramp she was ascending, I don't see her. I got to the top of the ramp and see a kid skateboarding on the last level of the garage. I tell him the garage is closed and he shouldn't be up here, but at the same time wondering where that woman went. The skateboarder apologized and said he'd walk down with me, if that would be okay. We get to the bottom and I say, "Hey man, you see anything weird at this garage tonight?" The skateboarder looked at me with the most confusing stare and said, "Well, there was this older woman standing at the edge of the garage and I didn't see her come up the ramp. I screamed she should be careful not to get too close to the edge. I went to pick up my board and when I looked up, she was gone. I ran to the edge to see if she jumped, but nothing. She was gone. She was wearing this old-looking dress and umbrella. I didn't want to tell the kid I saw the exact same woman because I was too freaked out. I suggested that it was probably a costume party and some people were messing around. I couldn't explain the disappearances, though. He said he thought the same thing, but he remembered his boss telling him that years ago, 20s era, people would dress up in their Sunday duds and walk through the park in town. The park was right where this parking garage was. Fato. Story 55? Probably a little too late to the party, but here we go. I've seen a few things working in remote locations on land and working oil rigs and platforms in the Gulf of Mexico, but I definitely think the eeriest was the one I never saw, but heard the countless stories from the people who had to investigate it. On a platform offshore, a man went missing during his nightly rounds. After searching the platform top to bottom, they found his hard hat, tool belt, work boots, and all his personal crap neatly placed on the grating near the railing, and he was Maya. Everyone has their stories of maybe it was just died because, as it turns out, living on a metal structure surrounded by water for weeks at a time takes its toll on you. Some people have their theories. He found out his wife was cheating on him at home. Some people even think it was nefarious and someone made him do it because he was having an affair with their wife. The oil field can be a dark place, both mentally and physically. All I know is jumping into the dark abyss of the ocean and letting the waves swallow you up is a terrifying concept to me. Second story happens along a dead stretch of highway around 3 a.m. I was making the drive back home from the docks, and around 3 a.m., I started getting so exhausted it was getting unsafe for me to drive. I was falling asleep, slapping myself in the face and sticking my head out the windows, trying to do anything I could to stay awake and make it home, but nothing was working. So, due to the time and location, there wasn't any safe places I could park to get a little bit of rest. So, in my sleep-deprived state, and I figured since I hadn't seen anyone else on the highway with me, I'd just pull over to the side of the road and get some rest. I leave my truck running with the lights on and set an alarm for 45 minutes. Well, on that truck, when you put it into park, it automatically unlocks your doors. Thank God, right before I fell asleep, I had the presence of mind to relock all my doors because about 10 minutes before my alarm went off, I woke up to the sound of the door handle on the rear passenger's door on my truck getting repeatedly yanked on, and it was shaking the whole truck. Needless to say, I was awake now and full of energy. All I can remember from the adrenaline dump that happened was I slammed the truck in gear and did probably the best burnout that truck has ever done, and threw rocks and smoke at Westcorper was behind me. The rest of the drive home, I remember swerving left and right, trying to make sure if someone was in the bed of my truck that I'd knock them out. I think the creepiest thing about that whole ordeal for me is there isn't a way for me to prove that it happened. At the time the incident happened, I had been awake over 24 hours, but I've also heard instances of that happening to people on that stretch of road. Call it a ghost, a dream, or some kids playing pranks on the poor people passing through town, but all I know is I'll never fall asleep parked on the side of the road again. I apologize for any formatting or spelling errors. I'm on mobile. Story 56. On our drill ship that was built in China, we noticed on the drawings there was a room. We went to look at it and couldn't find an entrance, but the spacing was obvious there was an extra room. It might not sound so creepy unless you've been in these shipyards where two things are known to happen. Stowaways, although I doubt it in this case, but also hundreds of workers at any given time following orders blindly. So we confirmed that the room had all 6 sides, yet not a single weld on the outside. There is only one way this could have happened, and I'm sure you're starting to get it now. They must have welded from the inside for this room and then realized they had no way out upon completion if the gases didn't kill them first. It's extremely heavy around that room. People say they hear things. I have definitely. This isn't some old ship either. I rode this ship from China to Amsterdam after completion and then the maiden voyage to America. I guess it happens quick. Story 57. I was a Comcast cable installer. I went to this very strange house. From the front, it was a very long house. Ranch, like a cigar shape. I walked in the front door into a long room with a total of 7 doors, all of which were locked. The owner must have come through one of them to let me into this main big room. On the floor on the right was a large tube TV, the kind one might get for free from someone throwing it out or at a Goodwill. It was sitting on the floor. No furniture in this room at all. The man said to me I was not allowed to go any further in this house, nor go into the basement to hook anything up, and that he had already hooked up the cable line in the basement up through the floor, and that all I needed to do was put in the small box and connect it. While doing this, a door opened, and there was a young boy with a very sad look on his face. His clothes were dirty, tattered, and he looked hopeless. The man quickly snapped at him to lock the door, and the boy vanished as quickly as he opened the door. Suddenly, the hair on my neck stood up, and it felt like this was a trafficking pedo situation. There was no signal over the cable wire, naturally, and I asked the man to get into the basement to check, and he adamantly refused. I explained he would have no cable, and he said fine in an angrily tone and basically threw me out. It was super creepy. Story 58. When I was a kid living in Queensland, Australia, I used to bush bash, meaning walk off the beaten track through thick scrub. I knew the national park my house backed onto like the back of my hand. I knew from the topography where I was at all times. Both my parents were ex-military and had a sort of hands-off, trusting me even as young as 17 to venture off on my own into the wilderness. So I could just pack a lunch, and my sister and neighborhood friend would come with. We'd head off early in the morning, returning just before sunset usually. Once, when I, the oldest, was about 19, we had been following creek beds and bashing over heavily forested hills towards an area I'd never been. We came down a hill, through a gully full of ferns, and followed a dry creek bed for another hour. The sides of the creek became steep and rocky. Before long, we were passing through a gorge. As we emerged from the gorge, we noticed what looked like a dwelling. Being idiot kids, we wanted to see what was up. It looked abandoned at first, but as we got closer, we saw that tarps had been affixed to the ramshackle structure. Chicken wire surrounded what looked like a pen just outside. As my eyes traveled across it, I suddenly caught another pair of eyes looking directly back at me. A Rottweiler. We started slowly edging back away from the property, but it was too late. The dog started going nuts, and worried that it was coming after us, or at least alerting the person /s living in the hut. We bolted. I went back to the area a few times, but not too close to the abode itself, and found discarded bones from small game and other bits and pieces, spent .22 casings and such. As an adult and knowing the area, it's very likely we stumbled across either a homeless person camping out or a meth lab, as the area, as I would find out as an adult, was absolutely riddled with meth labs.